time. Welcome, everyone. My name is Alexa, and I'll be your host today. Thanks for joining us for Continuous Testing, Fact or Fiction with Jeff Payne. First, I would like to go over some features in Adobe Connect that you can use during today's web seminar. If you have not done so already, you can download a copy of the seminar materials from the Resources section on the right side of your screen. All comments posted in chat are visible to everyone by default. If you experience any sort of technical difficulty and need assistance, please send me a private chat message. To do so, in the upper right-hand corner of the chat panel, select Start Chat With, and then my name, Alexa Angel. Enter your message, and I'll help you immediately. You can also use the Set Status menu located next to the main menu navigation at the top of your screen to show agreement, ask the speaker to speak louder, or share some applause.
Awesome. Thanks, Alexa. Good day, everybody, and welcome to Continuous Testing, Fact or Fiction. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jeff Payne. I'm the CEO of Coveros, and we've been doing these webinars now for about a year and a half, and I hope you're enjoying them. A little bit on my background. So I've been building and testing software long now, about 3 decades, and have run a couple of software companies, all focused around software assurance and Agile and DevOps. My current company is Coveros. Been running it now for about 12 years, and we help people with everything associated with Agile and DevOps, transformations, training, coaching, and also rolling up our sleeves and working with your teams and working with your leaders to help put Agile and DevOps practices in place. I'm also the technical editor for what's called Agile Connection, which is an online community of Agile and DevOps professionals. We put out blogs every week and often interviews and other content. It is free. So if you're interested in Agile and DevOps and you want to be in the community and learn a lot more about these subjects and how test integrates into those things, please go to agileconnection.com and sign up. I'm also always looking for authors. If you like to write and would like to write blogs or anything else for Agile Connection, just drop me a line at my Twitter address and we can. So that's a little bit about me. I do want to find out a little bit about you. So let me pop up a quick poll here. And if you could, just respond and let me know what your role is in the organization. And if you don't see your role in here, just click Other. And if you could in the chat, just put what your role is. Get an idea of who's here and what your role is. And I'll give you a few seconds to do that, and then we'll share the results and everybody can look at it. Looks like most everybody has responded, so let me go ahead and broadcast the results. Not surprising, right? This is a webinar on testing, continuous testing, so it looks like we have quite a few people from the testing community. Welcome. You from DevOps and management, an executive or two, and some others. We've got SQA managers, we've got consultants, Agile teams, a good mix of people. And as we're going to hear, continuous testing involves really everybody in the community and in your team and in your environment. So it's good that there's so many different perspectives here. So I call this talk Continuous Testing, Fact or Fiction, because about 2 years ago or so, maybe it was 3 years ago, I started hearing the term continuous testing. All right, and of course the word continuous gets thrown around in these DevOps days a lot. We hear continuous everything, right? Continuous development, delivery, deployment, security. But I started hearing continuous testing, and I noticed that a lot of the providers of testing solutions that were sponsoring and exhibiting at conferences started to put continuous testing on their booths. They started to integrate it in and include it in their literature. And I got curious about it. What exactly was continuous testing? And was it anything different than what we've been doing in the testing community for decades? And so I set out to figure that out. And what I'm going to present today is some of the findings of what I discovered when I was looking into what continuous testing actually was. So we're going to start off with a little quiz just for fun to see what you think is fact or fiction. I'm going to put up some statements, and I want you to respond. I'm going to open a poll. Let me know whether you think the statement is fact or whether it's actually fiction. Okay? First statement I'm going to make is continuous testing was first coined by Gene Kim in a talk about DevOps in 2014. Let me pop up a quick poll. You can tell me whether you think this is actually fact or fiction. You think this is fact or fiction? Go ahead and vote. All right, so we've got 64% said it's fiction, and about 36% said it was fact. All right. Hide that poll. Well, the reality is this is fiction. Good job, those of you that picked fiction. Actually, the earliest reference to continuous testing that I could find was in 2003. And it was a conference talk about testing and moving testing earlier in the process, and they used the term continuous testing. Now, I'm sure it got used before that, but that was the first reference that I could find going out and looking for it. Interestingly enough, around the same time, Kent Beck, who's very well known in the Agile community, right? He's kind of the author or inventor of XP practices, test-driven development. He, in a book he wrote talking about development and integrated environments for Java, mentioned that integrating testing into your IDE and doing testing as you went was something that he thought was really important. And as you'll see, when I define continuous testing, that aspect is going to be part of it. Let's do another. Fact or fiction? Continuous testing was referenced in a 2018 DevOps report as a key enabler for DevOps. All right, let me open a poll and see what you all think about that. All right, let's see what we got. Wow, almost 86% said that this was fact. All right, interesting. Let me tell you that it is fact. And I'm actually going to show you some results from that study because it does add some interesting insight into the role that testing plays in a modern development process, which today really is a DevOps process. We'll talk about that in a little bit. One more before we get into continuous testing and what I think it is. Last one. Continuous testing means we test more frequently than before, but error on the side of speed over quality. Almost 87% said that statement was fiction. All right. Well, let's look and see. Well, you are correct. So this audience did excellent. Kudos to you. You all did very well on the test. It is fiction. As you're going to see, the results really point to the importance of quality in DevOps. So let's talk a little bit about that. What really is continuous testing? When I went out and I looked for a definition, what I found, like a lot of things in software, was there was a million different definitions. Everybody had their same approach and way of wording things, and some of them I really liked, and there were some I really didn't like. I didn't really think they were very good at all from what I was reading. I also read a couple books on continuous testing. I read a bunch of papers. I read a bunch of reports. And I did a couple of what are called word balls. And there's a couple of them here where you take a report, you run it through, and it looks to see what words are used most. Sometimes it's an interesting way to see how people are talking about a certain subject. And what you'll see here for these two reports that I have here on the screen that were continuous testing related, of course, you see the word testing all over it, testing, testers, tests, data. But you see things like automation and continuous. You see tools, you see teams, you see lots of other words that are all good words, but they don't really get to a definition. So I went ahead and I created my own definition, kind of munging together the things that I thought made the most sense. And here's my definition. So I think of continuous testing as the practice of testing through the entire life cycle. And our goals are to rapidly uncover and fix problems, unexpected behaviors, but also to provide the organization information that they can use to make good business decisions. Now, we're going to delve into the different aspects of what I'm describing here, So I can get this down into the kind of the pieces that are key for what I call continuous testing. But before I do that, I have to address the elephant in the room. And that's this word, or as it's called correctly, a portmanteau, a combination of two parts of a word called DevOps, right? And people misunderstand DevOps. I've heard so many more definitions for DevOps than I have for continuous testing that it's almost ridiculous. But the way I always explain it to executives when we go in and help organizations transition to DevOps is like this. Dev and ops, those two words, doesn't mean that DevOps is about dev and ops working together. Instead, think about the term dev and ops, development and operations, as what I call the bookends, right? And what I mean by that is that there is a bunch of stuff in the middle. Now, I've picked out some books here that happen to be about quality, because I'm passionate about quality. Things like testing and reliability and security and performance and all those things are part of this concept of DevOps. There's other pieces to it too, right? Business and release management and all the other aspects between the entire life cycle. DevOps is really just, those terms are just the bookends to the process. We want to consider everything that goes on as part of DevOps and really focus on getting everyone in that supply chain all working together and collaborating. Now, because people misunderstand this term DevOps, you'll hear a lot of what I call DevOps mutants. DevSecOps, you might hear, right? We're going to jam security into the middle of that. Well, security is already there, right? If you think about Dev and Ops as a set of bookends instead of it just being about Dev and Ops. I've heard people use the term Devtest Ops to describe testing being integrated into DevOps. Again, to me, that's just DevOps if you look at it as bookends. I actually went to a conference a while back and I had to chuckle because somebody got up and they said, our organization is so advanced that we're beyond DevOps. Today, we do biz, dev, test, sec, perf ops. I almost fell out of my chair because and then this person went on to describe exactly what DevOps is, which is getting everybody in the process working together. All right, so think about DevOps in that way when you discuss it with me. Now, I mentioned this report that continuous testing was mentioned in. The Accelerate report, the State of the DevOps report as it's called, is something that's been being published now yearly for quite some time. And it's very interesting information. An organization called DORA, DevOps Research and Assessment Organization, goes out every year. They survey any and every company that's doing or is seeking to do DevOps. And they ask them some questions and they do a survey and they collect that information and then they report on the results. All right. And what I'm showing here on the right side are some key metrics that the Accelerate report year after year collects and uses to see how organizations are doing. Now, this report looks at organizations and buckets them into different categories, from kind of highly DevOps functioning and successful from a metrics results perspective, and all the way down to very low performing. And they look at 4 different key metrics. There's obviously lots of other metrics we can collect that they like to kind of anchor their analysis on. And they're at the bottom of this graph in the different colors. The first is deployment frequency. That's just how often you deploy new capability to your customer. How frequently does that happen? Does it happen every second, every minute, every hour, every day, every week, every month, every year? How frequently do you deploy? Right. The second one that the Accelerate report typically tracks and measures is what they call lead time to change. From the time you make a change to a piece of code, any piece of code, how long does it take in your process on average for that code to get into production, i.e. into the hands of your customer. The third metric that they collect is called time to restore service. If something in production goes wrong and you have to make a fix or back it out or patch it, do whatever you need to do to correct it, how long does that take? How long does it take to diagnose the problem, figure out what the fix is, fix the problem, retest the problem, and get it back into production? And last but not least, the metric change failure rate. This is how often you put something new, a change, into production, and that change didn't work. It had to be fixed or corrected or responsive. What is your percentage of success? Now, what I personally like about these metrics is if you think about what these things mean, the two on the left, deployment frequency and lead time for change, is really about speed. It's how fast can I get change and value to my customers, and from the time I actually decide to make a change and I create some code, how fast can I get it there? On the right are metrics that are more quality centric, right? They're about how fast can you restore service when something inevitably goes wrong, and how often do you actually push code out that doesn't work at all. Now, I will note something critical, and that is if you look over time at these metrics, and as I mentioned, Dora has been doing these surveys for quite some time now, what you'll see is that in general, there are exceptions and it fluctuates year to year. The metrics associated with speed, the gap between the lowest performers and the highest performers has shrunk, all right? That was definitely the case for both deployment frequency and lead time in 2016 and 2017. The same thing for deployment frequency in 2018, but lead time did bump back up. But you'll notice that in terms of restoring service and the change failure rate, the gap has widened, right, for those on the low end versus the high end of the DevOps spectrum, which says quality is getting worse between the best and worst organizations. We'll drill into that a little bit more and talk about why, and also what you can do. And continuous testing is part of that answer. The other piece of information that I found fascinating in this report had to do with where organizations spend their time. All right, what's interesting is that the lowest performers, shown here on the right side of the screen, about 30% of their time is spent on new work, meaning new capability and features that can give customers value, whereas 70% of their time is spent on everything else that they have to do, every kind of unplanned and rework that you can imagine, including fixing bugs and issues and dealing with support issues with customers. Whereas the best organizations, what in the survey are called the elite organizations, spend about 50% of their time. So approximately 80% more of their time versus the low spent on new work and new value to customers. That in and of itself is interesting, but if you dig into the numbers underneath it, you find some other interesting aspects. One thing that struck me was that if you take out of the equation the time spent fixing bugs and dealing with customer support issues and security issues, the amount of unplanned work and rework that's done is pretty constant from low to elite. What this tells me is that as much as we try, and we certainly try in our organizations to reduce the amount of unplanned work and rework we do, there's only so much progress we can make. And that some of it is completely out of our control. In fact, some percentage of it is constant, it appears, irrespective of the DevOps practices we have in place. But if you look at the rows below unplanned work and rework, you'll see the real difference between the low performers and the high performers in this report. And that is that low performers spend a huge percentage of time, usually 100 to 150% of their time, 200% of their time on fixing bugs, and dealing with customer support challenges. And this is really where the difference is, where the elite organizations accelerate and differentiate themselves. It's not in the speed, it's in quality, as the last slide showed. Now, this gets me to what I call my first reality check for continuous integrated testing. And that is that you are not going to realize significant benefits from DevOps without effective quality mechanisms. And in DevOps, that's really what continuous testing is trying to give you. And we're going to talk about that in a bit. The last thing I want to show you before we drill into some of the aspects of continuous testing and what they mean has to do with manual versus automated work. This graph shows the percentage of time across 4 different types of work that we do that have traditionally been very, very manual. Configuration management, testing of our software, deployments of our software, and the change approval process in general. And you'll see huge differences between low and elite organizations in the amount of effort that's manual. What this means is that elite organizations are figuring out how to automate these processes effectively. Not completely automate them, but automate them to the point where they are successful, gaining the quality they need in the market while also achieving their speed. They're getting their cake and they're eating it too. The other thing you'll notice about this graph, which I find interesting, is that when you go from low to medium, actually, from a manual perspective, testing and change approval gets more manual, right? So the low performers are actually doing more automation than the medium performers, which seems counterintuitive, unless you're in one of those low performing organizations, because you know what's happening, which is we're pushing automation in our organizations, but we're doing so before we understand how to put in place, or we've put in place good process to make sure that that automation actually has value. And so a lot of low performing organizations are focused on speed. We saw that from previous charts, but they're not focusing on quality, and that's biting them in the butt. And so in order to mature, they're taking a step back and they're saying, well, we need to move back to some manual practices for a bit while we mature. And then once we figure out what our good testing practices are, we can move forward and start to automate again. And then you see the amount of manual effort drop dramatically. That gets me to my second reality point, which is continuous testing does not equal 100% test automation. Sure, we're automating more today in the testing process than we probably ever have, but it doesn't mean we're automating it all, right? And those organizations that are on this push to automate everything are missing the boat. They're focused on the wrong thing, right? They should be focused on making sure that testing is effective and efficient. And part of making it efficient is to figure out what you can and can't automate, and automate the things that you actually can get a return on. And this report talks about the fact that in DevOps, not everything is going to be automated. That is a misperception. Now, you've often seen the infinity sign used to describe DevOps, right? Because inherently, this idea of DevOps is that we discover what customers need, we design out what they need, we build it and implement it, we deploy it, we put it into operation, we get feedback, and that feedback gives us new ideas for what we discover. So you'll see this infinity sign a lot. I like the infinity sign. We kind of, I guess you could say we spiffed it up a little bit and made it more, I don't know, geeky, I would say. Made it, something that I can use, though, being a math minor. I like things that are a little geeky. So we're going to put continuous testing into the context of this continuous process that we call DevOps. So let's talk about what it means to be continuous. Well, duh, it's called continuous testing for a reason. We're going to test continuously. Everything's going to be tested. And so this piece of DevOps, to me, being continuous, it means that what we're actually doing is that testing is happening everywhere, happening before, during, and after changes we make to our code. And we're testing not only the code itself, but everything in the process that we have in DevOps. I'll give you some examples of some activities that I would consider to be very continuous as part of a testing process. The first is collaborating around our requirements, using something like behavioral-driven development, BDD, getting everybody on the same page. I can tell you that when we come into organizations, this is usually one of their biggest challenges on teams, is the requirements aren't stable, the requirements aren't well understood, and they're not well defined to the point that you can build and test against them. They're too vague and fuzzy. But behavioral-driven development, and we have an excellent 2-day course on BDD that we provide, really teaches you how to get your business, your developers, and your testers all working together to deliver good software. That's a continuous process around your requirements process. Second thing is we need to be constantly validating change. Regression testing is a good example of doing this continuous activity. Right? In DevOps and in Agile, as you see from this slide, we're going to want to continuously build and test our software as we go. But the only way that model works, where we're constantly changing the software, refactoring that software, and then putting out changes to that software, is if we have a very strong regression testing capability that will find changes that broke other things. You know, studies show that every bug we fix, 30% of them will break something else. We have to have a safety net to catch that. And that's what our regression testing and validating changes is all about. And it's the other reason we need automated tests. We don't have the time to manually regression test every time a change is put into our build process. We need that to be more automated. The other thing we can do to be continuous is do some pairing. So I wrote a paper on getting developers and testers to pair together, do things together. Anybody that's interested, just reach out and we can send you a copy of that. But I really feel that the whole issue with developers and testers learning to work together is much more cultural than it is technological. It's that we have never had to do that, and we don't know what to do together. There are some very simple, basic things we can do that make the quality of what we're doing much more effective. So that's being continuous. That's the first part of what I call continuous. The second part is what I call shifting left. And what that means is there are some testing activities that we have traditionally done late in the life cycle that we want to do earlier in the process. So shifting left is all about removing downstream blockers. I typically testing or setup and teardown of testing environments to find and fix defects closer to where they're introduced. We all know the benefits of doing that. It's more cost effective typically to find and fix a bug close to where it originates. And it also speeds up our ability to push code toward production if we don't have large blocks of testing activities that are very late in that process. So that's what shifting left is all about. Some things that are examples of shifting left: test-driven development. So using tests to drive implementation instead of vice versa. Moving things like security and performance earlier in the process. Sure, we may not be able to complete our security testing or our performance testing early in the process, but we sure as heck can start it. There are tools available and things we can put into our development environment and into our continuous integration process that are going to allow us to find and fix issues earlier. And that's what we want in shift left. And last but not least, we'd like for our developers to participate in the testing process. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about whole team quality. So that's shifting left. Now let's talk about what I call shifting to the, there we go, shifting to the right. Now, when I first heard the term shift right, I thought it was crazy. Why would you want to shift testing right? I've been talking for 30 years about shifting testing left. I wasn't calling it that, but that's what I was talking about, getting it into the development process where it was more cost effective. Why the heck would we want to shift to the right? When I first heard this term, I was like, well, that's crazy. There's nothing we want to shift to the right. Well, that actually isn't true if you think about it. All right. And shifting right is all about two things. It's about leveraging real customers and leveraging production data. If you think about it, there's certain types of testing that we can't really do and do well without real customers. Sure, product owners are great, BAs are great, they provide a valuable service, they're a proxy to our customer, but the reality is our end customer is really the final decision maker on whether they like our software or not. Second is there are some systems where it is very difficult to replicate or simulate or otherwise create test data that looks like production. There's also security issues with doing that, right? And so some of our testing actually we should be doing with our customers using real data, and the results we get are going to be better. And that's what shift right is all about. Here are some examples of shift right testing. Customer feedback, right? Whether it's A/B on a particular approach where you send out two versions that each use a different approach to a feature, and you see which one customers like better. Canary testing or trying out something, monitoring and self-healing production issues, usability, user experience, customer satisfaction ratings, engagement ratings. These are all things that we need real customers to be involved in to get really good test results. And that's what Shift Right is all about. And last but not least is what I call adding business value. In DevOps, when you go into an organization that's gone whole hog into DevOps, you'll usually see lots of dashboards, screens all over the organization showing metrics. Maybe some of the metrics I talked about earlier, and showing releases and code moving toward production and all sorts of other things. To me, continuous testing has to be about taking our testing capabilities and our results and figuring out how to put them into a good business focus, right? Because ultimately, it's all about business. If we can't figure out how to leverage what we do in testing to help make good business decisions, I don't really know what our role is then, other than to find and fix bugs. And that's too tactical a role, in my opinion, for a piece of the organization that's around quality. We need to be focused on helping to drive and make business decisions around the application, its quality, and its fit for use by customers. And so we have to integrate testing into these dashboards. Make sure they're part of those dashboards that talk about DevOps and demonstrate DevOps metrics. We need to integrate into dashboards that talk about the business results and success. And we need techniques and tools that help us align what and what we've tested to both the business risks and mitigating those risks that exist and our overall value or strategy for our business. If we can align our testing to those things, it makes testing more relevant and more important, quite honestly, in terms of the business perspective. Now that gets me to my third reality statement, which is you can probably tell everything I'm talking about here is very collaborative. Trying to do continuous testing in a siloed testing organization is not going to be very successful. In fact, Dora called out this, not testing specifically in the Accelerate report, but they called out the fact that organizations that have siloed functional teams are 3 times as likely to be in the low performers from a DevOps perspective versus a high performer. 3 times as likely. The reality is, until your organizations shift its cultural and structural capabilities and capacities, you're going to struggle with DevOps and this key enabler, continuous testing. So let me give you, before we end, 7 what I call continuous testing enablers. These are 7 things that you're going to, over time, you don't have to have them all up front, put in place to be successful doing what I'm describing as continuous testing. Now, I've been asked, why is there 7 of these? Well, it's a prime number. I was a math minor, right? Prime numbers are great numbers. I love prime numbers. The reality is I just couldn't think of an 8th one, so I went with 7. So here they are. First is whole team quality. I mentioned this earlier. Everybody on the team, everybody in the entire organization has to care about quality. That's why it needs to be one of those top metrics that balances against speed for you to be successful and have your cake and eat it too and be an elite organization. Now, teams will ask me, gosh, it's frustrating because the developers, in our sprints, we're really running little mini waterfalls. So the developers really don't give us anything until the last day of the sprint. And then they expect us to work over the weekend to test it. Well, they go home and relax. And that's not fair. And I agree that's not fair. You read my pairing article, you'll see there's lots of ways you can avoid that happening. And there's things I didn't even cover in there as well. But I'll give you one simple way to stop that from happening. It has to come from the person leading the team, though. And that is, nobody's done until everybody's done. Put that philosophy in place. Say, nobody goes home until testing is finished. Are you having trouble getting your developers to participate in testing? Oh, that'll fix it. Believe me. They'll get real creative. They'll tell you up front, oh, I don't know how to test. I don't know what to do. I'm not good at that. It's not my thing. You tell them they can't go home until it's done, they will figure it out really quick. So that's one way you can get it going, but you do need the authority to be able to do that. You need whole team quality in place for this to work because everybody's going to be responsible for being involved. The business, the developers, and the testers are all going to be involved in testing. The second thing is, as much as possible, you need production-like environments. If you're going to push and shift some of your testing earlier, it's going to be more effective the more production-like those environments are. Now, if you're in the cloud, this is a lot easier, obviously, than if you're in a physical data center or a physical test lab or wherever you have your equipment set up for your development and testing. But you can still do those things in a physical environment. So don't use that as an excuse. But the more you can move to the cloud, leverage the cloud for your dev and test, the more you can make your environments look production-like. You can also leverage things like Docker, containerization, which will define an environment that can be used across all the different physical capabilities or environments you have. The third is build orchestration and continuous integration. You can't do Agile or DevOps without continuously building and testing your code as you go. This whole idea of incremental building and creating change and pushing it toward production quickly all relies upon an integrated dev test loop that you have to have in place to be successful. The fourth is automating testing below the user interface. Right now, for decades, we have unfortunately focused test automation on UI-based capture replay types of approaches. It's not going to work in a DevOps world. All right, there's a lot of problems with testing through the UI. The tests are more brittle. The tests are slower, a lot slower, and sometimes they fail because of delays or other things that are variable. If you move your automation to below the UI and do it at the API or service level or the backend level, the tests are fast, the APIs hardly ever change, and when they do, they're very well defined. We don't have these variances that we see at the system level. Highly recommend moving your automation over time in that direction. Service virtualization. If we want to push individual components of code through to production on a very regular basis, we can't sit and wait for everybody else's code and all the other components that are being built to be finished. We're not going to try to push this entire application through our pipeline. We're going to push each individual component through that. And that will only work if we have the ability to simulate and emulate the other services that our components interact with on a regular basis. And service virtualization is all about techniques for having available simulated or emulated capabilities that you don't have access to today, so you can be effective in your test. So the second to last one is infrastructure as code or container orchestration. A lot of time in testing, our time is spent setting up and tearing down test environments, either doing it ourselves or waiting for somebody to do it for us. All right. The more we can automate that process, so I can push a button and pop up a test environment when I need it, and when I'm finished with it, I can push another button and tear it down and it goes away, the faster I can deploy and test my code. And last but not least, test data management. I mentioned this in Shift Right. We have to manage our testing data effectively to test effectively. And whether it's shifting right and moving some of that into production, that testing, or it's figuring out ways to replicate and mask data that we have that we know is correct, we have to address test data management in order to do what we're talking about here in continuous. That the reality is you have to invest in these enablers. You don't have to do them all up front, as mentioned, but over time you're going to want to put them in place because they're going to help you deliver on doing things continuously, shifting left, shifting right, and integrating testing into your business process. So I want to leave you with some things that you can share with your boss. I call this slide the what your boss needs to know. What is it that you should take home and make sure your boss understands, whoever that boss is? Well, point number one, you're not going to realize significant benefits from DevOps without putting continuous testing in place. You've got to get a good testing process in place that does the kinds of things that I described if you're going to become one of those high-performing DevOps organizations. Without that quality, you're just not going to get there. Second is, testing in a DevOps world does not equal 100% automation. Don't fall into that trap. Yes, a significant amount of automation can significantly speed up your process and mature you from a DevOps perspective, but it's not the silver bullet. And you have to weigh the costs and the ROI of automation to decide where the right balance is for you. Third is that siloed testing groups will not be successful. The other thing that was called out by the Accelerate report is if you have a siloed organization, I mentioned you're 3 times as likely to be a low performer than a high performer. If you outsource a function, outsource your testing, for instance, to another organization, so not only is it siloed, but it's siloed and run by somebody that's not you, then you're 4 times as likely to be a low performer versus a high performer. Now, I've seen outsourcing capabilities work effectively in the wild. You just have to make sure you do them right. And outsourcing functions is just building a silo, and we're trying to break down silos in DevOps. And last but not least, you're going to have to do some investment in the enablers that I discussed if you want continuous testing to be successful and DevOps to be successful as well. So first, if you're interested in learning more, there's some learning opportunities coming up that I want to make you aware of. We have actually a couple of virtual learning training classes coming up, one on test automation, fundamentals of automation, and one on our foundations of DevOps. So if you're interested in these subjects, there are opportunities to virtually learn these subjects. There's also some in-person events coming up. Many of you are aware of the Star West conference next week, also some Additional conferences and training opportunities coming up later in this year. The Agile DevOps East Conference is a conference that talks everything and anything Agile and DevOps related. And then there's a hands-on and a leadership track to what we call our DevOps Week DC event, which is a week-long set of training classes around all things DevOps and DevOps tools. If you're interested, there's also hands-on learning opportunities that we can bring on site as private group learnings. And here are some of the examples at the bottom of this slide. The last thing before we answer questions is, if you haven't heard of the Hub, you must be living under a rock. The Techwall Hub is a free Slack community of software professionals. We have around 4,000 software professionals that are part of this community now. It was launched less than a year ago. It is free. It's all things dev, test, automation, leadership, agile, DevOps. There's lots of different channels. And every day people are on there asking questions, getting help from the community, helping each other. And we often have people come on as what we call Slack takeovers, where an expert spends a day in a channel answering your questions and talking about things. If you're interested, you can click your phone on the QR code here, or just go to the URL and sign up. As mentioned, it's free. It's a community service that Techwell provides, and we'd love to have you join as well.
Okay, first question is from Telvin.
10 minutes left. What else, Alexa?
What are effective ways to understand how much value your current automated testing implementation has?
No, that's great, right? Effective ways to measure the value of your automation. That is an excellent question. So my thoughts are, there are a couple ways you can do that. All right. The first thing is looking at bug escape rates. How many defects is your automation finding versus how many are escaping, right? Now, the total number is going to depend on the quality of your code. So I don't really care about the total number of defects. I care more about how many is it finding versus how many is it missing. That'll give you an idea of how effective that testing is. And as you're doing manual testing, I would do the same comparison and see how effective your automation is versus the manual testing that you're doing, to make sure that they're how they compare. The second thing is, you have to measure the amount of time it takes to implement your automation and maintain that automation. You're going to do a good cost comparison, because it's a lot cheaper to run a test once manually than it is to build an automated test and run it once. And so you're going to need that automation to run many, many times, and ideally run many, many times without breaking, for you to see a return. And you should be measuring that so you know. And different kinds of testing, right, are going to give you different types of return. I mentioned earlier, if you're doing UI-based test automation, even if you're writing the scripts yourself, you're going to you typically have a lot more problems and a lot more time spent debugging and addressing tests that failed, to see, was it the automation, was it the code, what happened, versus doing that at a lower level in API. So you will see a different ROI at different levels of test automation that you're doing.
Okay, next question. Brajesh asks, you talk about dev/test pairing. How do I best get that rolling in our sprints?
Yeah, great question. So my recommendation, and it really gets back to how you sprint plan, right? Part of the sprint planning that we typically advocate when we're coaching teams is, you're figuring out who's doing what, and you're getting very specific about who's owning stories. What you often don't see, though, is explicitly pairing a dev and test to work on stories. So that's one, is you should be explicitly talking about who's going to work with who. That's one. Two is, I've set up what I call pairing charts, and I make it a game, gamify it. You put all the developers down one side, you put all the testers on the other side, and the goal is in the next program increment or release or whatever that bigger picture thing is you're moving toward, or maybe you're just saying every quarter we want to do X. Your goal is that every dev and every tester spends some amount of time in a sprint on a story, pairing and working together, and you track it. And it also cross fertilizes knowledge while also building relationships between everybody in the sprint, because at some point everybody's working with everybody else. In terms of an activity that I think is the easiest thing for you to do, it's reviewing each other's tests. So developers are really used to doing code review. All right. If you take your tests that you've created for the acceptance criteria for the story and you say to the developer, check these out and see if you think these are good tests. And you sit with them and you talk about them and you discuss whether the tests you've come up with meet the acceptance criteria. One is you're going to find out whether you're all on the same page about what the story is all about. So there's some additional benefit there. But two is a lot of times the developers, because they understand the design and what's being implemented, can give you some thoughts and ideas on other tests that might be useful. Similarly, when your developers create unit tests or component tests or whatever level it is you ask them to be involved in the testing process, you can add a lot of value by reviewing their tests and having them walk you through what they're thinking about how they're testing the particular capabilities that they're building at a low level. That will also teach them how to be better testers. Because look, I was a developer. I can tell you I wasn't a very good tester. Before I got into the testing space, my view was if it compiles, it works, right? And so I didn't really spend a lot of time worrying about testing, and nobody was mentoring me that I needed to do that. That approach just isn't going to cut it these days in the world we live in, DevOps. We're expecting developers to test, but that doesn't mean they've ever been taught how to test. Sitting with you as a tester and you giving them thoughts and ideas about testing at the boundaries, right? And testing different paths, covering code, thinking about equivalence classes and different ways to test effectively is going to make them a better tester.
Okay, next question is from Dinesh. What are the common automation tools that support DevOps?
Oh, wow, that's a good one. There is a bazillion testing tools out there, as you know, right? And I think all the testing tool, vendors will claim that their tests will support a DevOps process. So instead of mentioning particular tools, I think we should talk about the different types of tools that are in that process, and then what maybe some of the characteristics are that make them useful in a DevOps process, right? Now, obviously, we mentioned the developers being involved in testing, usually at the unit level. If they're doing test-driven development or just creating good unit tests, whatever, there are certainly unit testing frameworks that you're going to want to use as part of a continuous testing, automated testing process for DevOps. Now, these tools and these types of tests are in the code itself, right? So they are inherently automated because it's code. They're writing code next to their application code that tests that application code. And so they typically call them unit tests or component tests. There are certain tools that have been created to help testers test the acceptance criteria that you might associate with a story to make sure that the story works properly. Yeah, sometimes they're called acceptance test tools, ATDD, acceptance test driven development, if you're familiar with that. I'll mention some open source tools, things like Cucumber come to mind as ways to represent tests in a natural language format and have them execute and validate that your stories work properly. Any of the functional tests testing tools that support, lower level API level types of testing and/or UI types of testing can be typically fit into a DevOps process, because even the user interface based testing tools all support what's called a headless model, which is they can run automatically in the background, so within a DevOps process, without the browser coming up and having to pop. It uses a virtual version of the browser that you don't see, and it can execute in your DevOps process. I would argue that these days, virtually every automated testing tool that's on the market supports the ability to integrate into a DevOps process, because that's who's buying tools.
Anything else?
No, thanks everybody for coming. And if you have any other questions or you think of anything, don't be afraid to reach out and chat. And if you're coming to any of the upcoming conferences, I will be at pretty much all the conferences that Techwell is holding this fall: Star West, Star Canada, and Agile DevOps East. I hope to see you. Come up and say hi, and we can chat further.